The black sedan cut through the rain-soaked streets like a knife, its engine a low growl against the steady drumming of raindrops. Inside, Marcus Blackwell, a self-made millionaire with a reputation for ruthlessness, adjusted his tie and glanced at his watch. Irritation flaring in his chest, he was already 15 minutes late for the most important meeting of his career. A merger that would seal his place among the financial elite. His driver navigated the slick roads with precision, the wipers fighting against the deluge outside. Marcus's mind raced, ticking through numbers and potential profits, rehearsing his pitch. Every second counted, and he couldn't afford distractions. Not today, yet, as they approached a red light near a rundown alley, something caught his eye. On the sidewalk, huddled beneath a flimsy, tattered blanket, was a woman. Her hair matted, clothes drenched, she clutched a small, crying baby to her chest, shielding it from the relentless rain. The sight jarred him, a jarring contrast to the comfort and power of his world. Her face was hidden, but he could see the desperation in the way her shoulders hunched over the child, as if trying to shelter it with her very body. "Keep driving," Marcus muttered to the driver, trying to dismiss the scene as yet another unfortunate fixture of the city's landscape. His life had taught him that. Sympathy was a weakness, a distraction that led to missed opportunities. But as the car began to roll forward, he caught a glimpse of the woman's eyes, a fleeting moment of anguish, framed by the blurred glow of the streetlights. A strange tension tightened in his chest. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself that he couldn't afford delays. He had people waiting, a boardroom full of executives and millions on the line. Yet the image of the woman and her child lingered in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "Stop the car," he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as his driver. The vehicle skidded to a halt, and Marcus hesitated, fingers drumming on the armrest. He knew he shouldn't waste time on this. There was nothing he could do, and it wasn't his problem. But the rain kept pounding, relentless and cold, and the memory of those eyes wouldn't let him go. With a resigned sigh, he grabbed his umbrella and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, soaking through his tailored suit within seconds. He walked toward the woman, each step feeling heavier, as if part of him knew that this choice would change everything. "Hey!" he called out, raising his voice over the downpour. She flinched, tightening her grip on the baby, as if expecting harsh words or a command to leave. But when she finally looked up, he saw something that made his breath catch, a mixture of defiance and fear, a silent plea masked by pride. "Do you need help?" he asked, struggling to keep the impatience out of his voice, wondering if he had made a mistake. He glanced back toward his car, the neon-lit cityscape beyond it, the life he knew so well slipping further away with each passing second. She stared at him, as if trying to gauge the sincerity in his question. He saw her lips tremble, her face pale, with exhaustion and cold, but she didn't speak. The baby in her arms whimpered, its tiny face scrunched up against the cold. Marcus felt a flash of frustration, at her, at the rain, at himself for stopping it all. He took a deep breath, ready to turn back, to leave her to her fate. But then, she whispered a single word, so faint he almost missed it. "Please." That one word cut through him, more than he cared to admit. Without another thought, he offered her his hand. He had no idea what he was doing, no idea why he felt compelled to intervene in a life so far removed from his own. But as she took his hand, her fingers icy against his, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, the rain, the baby's soft cries, the woman's desperate gaze, was about to change everything he thought he knew. And in the back of his mind, a question began to form. Was he truly saving her, or was he the one who needed saving? Marcus held the umbrella over the woman and her child, feeling the chill of the rain as it seeped into his shoulders. She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the car idling at the curb. He could see her weighing the risks, but there was no time to waste. The rain was coming down harder, and the baby's cries grew more desperate, a small, trembling sound against the roar of the storm. "Come on!" he urged, more firmly this time, his impatience breaking through the thin veneer of calm. "You'll freeze out here." After a moment of hesitation, she nodded and allowed him to lead her to the car. Marcus opened the back door, and she slipped inside, curling into a corner, clutching the child tightly as if she expected it to be taken from her. He watched her for a moment, then climbed in after her, shaking the rain from his umbrella. The door shut, sealing them inside the warmth of the car. But the air was tense, charged with unspoken questions. "Where are we going, sir?" the driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror with a raised brow. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize when something unusual was happening. Marcus hesitated. Where were they going? He couldn't exactly bring her to the meeting, dripping wet and with a baby in tow. His instincts screamed at him to drop her at the nearest shelter and move on. But when he looked at the woman's hollowed cheeks and the desperation etched into her eyes, he found he couldn't say the words. "Just drive for now," he said finally, loosening his tie as the car started moving again. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, stealing glances at the woman. She was young, probably not older than her mid-20s, but life had carved deep lines of hardship into her face. Her clothes were soaked, and she shivered despite the heat blowing through the vents? "Do you have a name?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. A grateful thank you, maybe, or at least a sign that she understood the unusual nature of this encounter. She glanced at him, still wary. "Emily," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She adjusted the baby in her arms, revealing a pale, tiny face peeking out from beneath a soaked blanket. "And this is Lily." Marcus nodded, feeling a strange awkwardness settle between them. What was he supposed to say next? He'd spent his life in boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations where every word had a purpose. But this felt different, like navigating a language he didn't understand. "Look, Emily," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I can't exactly take you with me to my meeting, but I can find a place for you to stay for the night, somewhere warm and dry." Her eyes flickered with a brief flare of hope, but then it faded, replaced by a guarded skepticism. "You're just going to drop us off somewhere and leave, aren't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I've heard that before." Marcus stiffened at the challenge in her tone. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he was trying to help. But there was something raw in her voice that stopped him from snapping back. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I don't know what you expect from me. I'm already late, and I've got a lot riding on this meeting," he said, the frustration creeping into his voice despite himself. "I'm just trying to do the right thing here, all right?" She turned away from him, looking out the window as the city blurred past, rain streaming down the glass. For a long moment, silence filled the car, broken only by the baby's occasional whimper. Marcus felt the weight of his own words pressing down on him, a sense of guilt he hadn't expected. It would be so easy to drop them off at a shelter, wash his hands of the situation, and forget this ever happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that this encounter had a meaning he couldn't quite grasp yet. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice softer, resigned. "I just want a chance," she murmured, almost to herself. "A chance to get Lily somewhere, safe, somewhere I don't have to worry every second about what comes next." Marcus's breath caught, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes that mirrored his own. An ache for something more, a life beyond the relentless grind of survival. He thought of his own rise from nothing, the countless nights spent clawing his way up, driven by ambition and the fear of going back to the streets he'd come from. Before he could think better of it, he made a decision, one that sent a jolt of anxiety through him, as if he were teetering on the edge of a cliff. "All right," he said quietly, surprising even himself. "I'll find you a place, but not just for tonight. I'll see if I can help. Properly." She turned back to him, her expression caught between hope and disbelief. "Why?" she asked, searching his face for answers. Marcus didn't have a good answer. Not yet. All he could do was offer her a faint, uncertain smile. "Maybe because I know what it's like to need a second chance." As the car sped through the rain-drenched city, the weight of that promise settled over them both. An unspoken bond forged in a moment of vulnerability. And as the city lights blurred past, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this detour would cost him everything, or if it might just lead him somewhere he never thought he'd go. The car glided to a stop in front of a small, unassuming hotel. On the edge of the city, it wasn't luxurious, far from the kind of place Marcus would typically find himself in, but it was clean, discreet, and, most importantly, open. He knew he couldn't take Emily and Lily to his penthouse without raising questions from the building staff, nor could he leave them stranded. So he settled on this compromise, though it left an uncomfortable knot of uncertainty in his chest. Marcus stepped out first, the rain still. Coming down in sheets, he turned to offer Emily his hand, but she was already out, cradling Lily protectively under her coat, avoiding the worst of the rain. She hesitated before following him up the few steps to the entrance, glancing at the faded neon sign and the shadowy figures lingering under the awning. She clutched Lily closer, casting a wary look at Marcus. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and stale. "Coffee!" The clerk behind the desk looked up from his magazine, raising an eyebrow at the sight of Marcus's drenched suit and Emily's bedraggled state. But Marcus was quick to flash his credit card, his authoritative air enough to silence any questions. "2 rooms, please," Marcus said briskly, sliding the card across the counter. He could feel Emily's eyes on him, filled with something unreadable. The clerk nodded and handed over 2 key cards. "Room 25. And 206, end of the hall," he said in a monotone, barely lifting his gaze from the screen. Marcus took the keys and gestured for Emily to follow. She trailed behind him, her footsteps hesitant against the worn carpet. He handed her one of the key cards as they reached the doors, glancing between the plain, battered room numbers. "You'll have privacy here," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "If you need anything, call me." He paused, fumbling for words. He wasn't used to saying, "I'll cover the costs until you figure out your next step." Emily stared at the key card in her hand, then back up at him. There was a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, but also something sharper, a lingering distrust. She bit her lip, as if deciding whether to ask the question that had been on her mind since they first met. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice barely audible in the echoing hallway. "People? Like you don't usually help people like me." Marcus stiffened at the implication, but found he couldn't disagree. He had always prided himself on his ability to make hard decisions, to put business before sentiment. But now, faced with the reality of this woman and her child, his usual logic felt strangely hollow. He ran a hand through his rain-soaked hair, searching for an answer he didn't have. "Maybe I'm just tired of being the person I've been," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Or maybe I see something in you that reminds me of where I came from." The words seemed to surprise them both, hanging awkwardly in the air between them. Emily studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether to trust this man who spoke like a stranger to himself. Finally, she nodded, accepting the explanation for now. She turned toward the door of her room, fumbling with the key card, her hands still shaking from the cold. But just before she slipped inside, she glanced back at Marcus, her expression softening for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying a sincerity that caught him off guard. Marcus only managed a nod in return, watching as she disappeared into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer, the shadows closing in around him, feeling a sense of emptiness settle in the pit of his stomach. He should have felt relief that he had done his part, that he could return to his own life now without this distraction. But instead, All he felt was a gnawing unease, a sense that this encounter was far from over. He retreated to his own room next door, loosening his tie and tossing his drenched jacket over a chair. The silence pressed in, the unfamiliar surroundings unsettling. He glanced at his phone, seeing a dozen missed calls and messages from the meeting he'd abandoned. The urgency of his previous life, of the deals and the money, seemed distant now, overshadowed by the memory of the rain-soaked night and the haunted look in Emily's eyes. Sinking onto the edge of the bed, he rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. He tried to convince himself that he had done enough, that he had no further obligation to this stranger and her child. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. As he stared out the rain-streaked window, he found himself wondering what Emily's story was, what had driven her to the streets, what secrets she was hiding behind that guarded expression, and more importantly, he wondered why he cared so much. But as the night dragged on and sleep eluded him, a nagging question crept back into his mind. Had he truly changed anything for her, or had he just thrown her a lifeline that could break at any moment? And what would he do if she slipped away again, swallowed by the shadows of a world he barely understood? Somewhere beyond the walls of the small hotel, the city hummed with its restless life, indifferent to the lives it consumed. But for Marcus, that hum was no longer just background noise. It was a reminder that he was caught in something bigger than himself, a choice that might rewrite the course of his carefully controlled world, and for the first time in years, Marcus Blackwell wasn't sure where he was heading. Marcus awoke the next morning to the sound of the city stirring to life outside the hotel window. The relentless rain replaced by a gray, misty dawn. He dragged himself out of bed, feeling the dull ache of too little sleep behind his eyes. His phone was already buzzing with new messages and voicemails from the office, demanding explanations and updates. But as he glanced toward the thin wall that separated his room from Emily's, he felt the usual urgency slipping away. He showered quickly, dressing in a wrinkled dress shirt he found in his suitcase, and tried to focus on the call he knew he needed to make. But before he could dial, a faint knock echoed through the thin hotel door. He hesitated, then set his phone aside and crossed the room, opening the door to find Emily standing in the hallway, Lily cradled against her chest. She looked slightly better this morning, her clothes still worn but dry, her hair combed back. Yet there was a tightness in her expression, a guardedness that told him she was still bracing for the worst. I don't mean to bother you, she began, her voice low, as if afraid of being overheard. But I need to find a place to get some formula for Lily. I don't have much left. Marcus studied her for a moment, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders sagged as if she carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. He knew he had every reason to tell her she was on her own, that he had a meeting to make up for and responsibilities that couldn't wait. But instead, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said, more gently than he intended. "I'll take you somewhere." They drove through the morning fog. The city's skyline blurred into a gray haze. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, while Emily sat quietly in the back seat, rocking Lily as she dozed. He tried to ignore the strange warmth that settled in his chest at the sight. So unfamiliar, so different from the cold attachment he had cultivated over the years. They pulled up outside a small convenience store, and Marcus cut the engine. He turned in his seat, handing her a few bills. "Get what you need," he said, feeling an awkwardness in the gesture. "I'll wait here." She hesitated, her eyes flicking between the money and his face, as if searching for the catch, but she eventually took the bills with a murmured thanks. Slipping out of the car and into the store, Lily bundled against her. Marcus watched her disappear through the glass doors, then leaned back, exhaling slowly. Minutes ticked by, and he found himself scrolling absently through his phone, barely registering the messages from the office. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. Why she had been out there in the rain, how she had come to this point. He wondered if he should ask, or if he even had the right to. But before he could untangle his thoughts, his phone rang. The name of his assistant flashing on the screen. "Marcus, you've been Maya since last night. The board is furious. The merger meeting is on hold until you explain yourself," his assistant said, her tone tense. With urgency, "Where are you? Are you okay?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, to give some polished excuse, but the words wouldn't come. He glanced toward the store, catching a glimpse of Emily at the counter, her face tight with concentration as she counted out the change. "I'm handling something," he said finally, his voice rough with uncertainty. "Tell them I'll be back this afternoon." The assistant hesitated, clearly thrown by his uncharacteristic vagueness. "This isn't like you, Marcus. You've got too much riding on this deal. You need to get your head back in the game." But Marcus only sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I'll deal with it, just hold them off a little longer." He hung up before she could press further, shoving the phone into his pocket. He knew she was right. This was out of character, a risk he couldn't afford, but when he looked back toward the Eid Asprey store and saw Emily stepping out, holding a small bag of supplies and clutching Lily close, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. She slipped back into the car, glancing at him with a flicker of unease. "I can pay you back," she said abruptly, as if the thought had been gnawing at her the entire time. "Once I find work, I don't want to owe anyone." Marcus shook his head, starting the engine. "It's not about the money," he said, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. He didn't know what it was about exactly, only that he couldn't turn away. Not yet. They drove in silence for a while, the city slipping past in shades of gray. Finally, he found himself asking the question that had been burning in his mind since last night. "Emily, what happened to you? Why were you out there in the rain?" She stiffened at the question, her fingers tightening around the bag in her lap for a moment. He thought she might snap back at him, tell him it was none of his business, but then she sighed, her breath fogging the window as she looked out at the passing streets. "I had a job, a place to live, a life," she said quietly, as if speaking to herself more than to him. "But Lily's father, he left us when things got hard. I tried to manage on my own, but the bills kept piling up. Lost my job, then the apartment. After that, it all went downhill fast." She turned back to him, her expression raw with bitterness and shame. "You think you know how to survive, but the city just chews you up, spits you out, and suddenly you're on the street with nothing but a few blankets and a baby to keep alive." Marcus felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a sympathy he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He thought of his own struggles, how close he had come to losing everything before. He'd clawed his way up, but unlike Emily, he'd always had the luxury of choosing his battles. She'd been given no choice at all. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough in his throat. He wasn't sure if he meant them for her or for himself, for the man he had been, who would have walked away without a second thought. She didn't respond immediately, but when she looked at him again, there was a glimmer of something different in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or a fragile trust that hadn't been there before. "Why did you stop for me, Marcus?" she asked softly, the question hanging between them like a challenge. He glanced at her, then back at the road, feeling the weight of his own uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, barely recognizing the vulnerability in his own voice. "But I think I'm starting to figure it out." As the car sped down the rain-slicked streets, Marcus couldn't help but feel that he was standing at a crossroads, one that could either bring him back to the life he knew or lead him somewhere he'd never imagined. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure which path he wanted to take. As the car moved through the increasingly congested traffic, Marcus felt a growing anxiety tightening his chest. Emily remained silent in the back seat, little Lily draped in her arms. But the tension between them feels tangible, like a string about. To snap, he made a decision quickly. Move on with the life he knew, or dive headfirst into the mess that was the lives of this woman and her daughter. "Marcus," Emily began suddenly, her voice shared with hesitation. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror and noticed something strange in her eyes, a deep fear he hadn't noticed before. "There's something I didn't tell you." Before she could continue, a screeching sound cut through the air. Tires, screeching on wet asphalt, followed by the impact of a car slamming into the side of Marcus's vehicle. The world turned upside down as the car careened down the street, glass shattering and the sound of twisting metal echoing in Marcus's ears. He felt his chest pressing down, the air being forced from his lungs as everything spun around him. The car finally stopped, on its side, with rain running down the broken windows. Marcus, dizzy and with a ringing in his ears, turned with difficulty, his entire body throbbing with pain. "Emilia! Emilia!" he said, his voice hoarse. Marcus struggled to regain his bearings, his head pounding from the impact. The rain poured through the shattered windows, soaking the interior of the car. He forced himself to turn, ignoring the sharp pain in his side, his voice strained with panic. "Emily! Are you okay? Emily!" For a moment, there was no response, only the hiss of rain and the distant hum of city traffic. Then, he heard a faint, pained murmur from the back seat. He twisted around and saw Emily cradling Lily, her arms wrapped protectively around the baby. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but she was conscious, her expression dazed and filled with terror. I'm okay," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at Lily, who let out a soft, frightened cry, but seemed otherwise unharmed. "Lily's okay too, I think. What happened?" Before Marcus could respond, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Two figures approaching through the rain, their shapes blurred by the downpour. A chill ran down his spine, sharper than the cold seeping into his bones. This didn't feel like a random accident. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the shattered screen, but before he could call for help, the car door was yanked open with a force that nearly tore it off its hinges. A tall, muscular man loomed over him, his face hidden beneath a hood, his expression hard and unreadable. Behind him stood a second figure, smaller but equally menacing. Marcus felt a jolt of fear. These weren't good Samaritans. "Get out of the car," the taller man ordered, his voice low and threatening. He reached in, grabbing Marcus by the collar and yanking him out onto the rain-soaked pavement. Marcus tried to resist, but he was still disoriented from the crash, his limbs heavy and uncooperative. He hit the ground with a thud, the cold water seeping into his clothes. "Leave her alone!" Marcus gasped, struggling to rise, but the smaller figure moved swiftly toward the back seat, where Emily clutched Lily tighter, her face pale with terror. "Please, no, don't hurt us," she cried, her voice breaking. But the taller man glanced at his partner and nodded toward Tzitzit. "Marcus." "We only want him," he said, his voice cold. "You got mixed up with the wrong people, Blackwell." Marcus's mind raced, panic mingling with confusion. "What are you talking about? Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice raw with desperation. He didn't recognize these men, but their words hinted at something deeper. A threat he hadn't seen coming, from a world he thought he had left behind when he clawed his way to the top. The smaller figure ignored his questions, turning to Emily with a sneer. "Get out of the car and we won't hurt the kid," he growled, his tone icy. Emily hesitated, fear etched into every line of her face. She glanced at Marcus, her eyes wide with a silent plea for help. But Marcus knew that he was in no position to bargain. These men meant business, and whatever they wanted with him, they wouldn't hesitate to hurt Emily and Lily to get it. Just as Marcus opened his mouth to try to reason with them, a sudden flash of movement caught his eye. Emily lunging forward, clutching a shard of broken glass from the wreck, she slashed at the smaller man's arm, drawing a sharp cry of pain as he stumbled back, clutching his bleeding wound. "Run!" Marcus shouted, adrenaline surging through him as he struggled to his feet. Emily didn't need to be told twice. She bolted from the car. Lily held close to her chest, disappearing into the shadows of the rain-drenched alleyway. Marcus turned to face the remaining attacker, his pulse thundering in his ears. The taller man glared at Marcus with a twisted smile, raising a gun hidden beneath his jacket. "You're going to regret that, Blackwell," he spat, but before he could take aim, Marcus lunged at him, desperation giving him strength. They grappled on the wet pavement, slipping and sliding as they fought for control. Marcus managed to knock the gun from the man's hand, sending it skittering across the street. But just as he thought he had the upper hand, the man delivered a brutal punch to Marcus's gut, knocking the wind out of him. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his vision blurring from the pain. But just as the man moved to retrieve the gun, a pair of flashing lights lit up the street. Police sirens cutting through the night. The attacker hesitated, glancing between Marcus and the approaching patrol car with a curse. He turned and fled into the shadows, disappearing into the maze of alleys. Marcus lay on the pavement, clutching his side, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The police car screeched to a halt, and 2 officers rushed out, their voices blurred by the pounding in his head. He tried to speak, to tell them about Emily and the men, but darkness closed in around him, dragging him down into unconsciousness. When Marcus came to, he found himself in a hospital bed, the fluorescent lights glaring overhead. His head throbbed and his body ached with every movement. But he forced himself to sit up, his mind racing with memories of the attack. Panic seized him as he remembered Emily and Lily. Had they gotten away? Were they safe? A uniformed officer stood at the foot of his bed, arms crossed. "Mr. Blackwell, you're lucky to be alive," the officer said, his tone gruff. "We found your car wrecked and signs of a struggle, but the suspects got away. Mind telling us what happened?" Marcus swallowed, his mouth dry. He knew he had to be careful. These men had made it clear that this was far from over. But, as he struggled to find the right words, the door to the hospital room creaked open, and Emily slipped inside. Her clothes still damp, Lily clutched against her chest. Relief flooded through him at the sight of her unharmed, but the look on her face was grim, her eyes dark with a new fear. She glanced at the officer, then back at Marcus, and he realized that she knew something he didn't. Something that could turn this whole situation on its head. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice trembling. "They weren't after you because of who you are now. They were after you because of me." The room seemed to tilt as her words sank in. Marcus stared at her, trying to piece together the Yushtai implications. "What do you mean? What did you get mixed up in, Emily?" She bit her lip, her hands trembling as she held Lily closer. "I tried to protect you, both of us. But those men, they're from my past, and they won't stop until they find what they're looking for." Marcus felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He had thought he was helping a woman and her child escape the rain, but now it seemed he was tangled up in something far more dangerous, a secret that could cost them all their lives. And as he looked into Emily's haunted eyes, he realized that his choice to stop that night had pulled him into a deadly game, where every move could be his last. Marcus's heart pounded as he processed Emily's words. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind that went deeper than just surviving the streets. There was a shadow over her that he hadn't seen before, a darkness she'd been carrying all along. The officer cleared his throat, looking between Marcus and Emily with growing suspicion. "Is there something you're not telling us, Mr. Blackwell? Or you, miss?" He gestured toward Emily, his pen hovering over a notepad. Emily's grip tightened around Lily, her knuckles white. "No," she said quickly, her voice trembling but firm. "We don't know who those men were. They came out of nowhere." The officer's gaze lingered on her, skeptical, but Marcus cut in before he could press further. "We were just in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you for your help, officer, but I think we're done here." The officer studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "We'll be in touch if we have more questions. And you should be careful, Mr. Blackwell. Whoever those guys were, they didn't look like amateurs." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Marcus and Emily alone in the sterile silence. As soon as the door closed, Marcus turned to Emily, his voice low and urgent. "You need to tell me what's going on. Why were those men after you? What have you gotten yourself into?" Emily backed away, cradling Lily as if she could shield her from the weight of her own secrets. "You wouldn't understand, Marcus," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't want to drag you into this. I just wanted to disappear, to give Lily a chance. But now it's too late." Marcus reached out, gently touching her arm, trying to steady his own rising panic. "You need to trust me, Emily. If those men come back, we won't stand a chance unless I know what we're up against, please. Tell me the truth." Emily looked down, her breath shuddering as she tried to gather herself. Finally she spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. "Before Lily was born, I got involved with some dangerous people. I thought I could make a quick deal, get some money to start fresh. But it went wrong. I ran with what they were looking for, and I've been hiding ever since. Those men, they think I still have it." Marcus's mind raced. This was much worse than he had imagined. "What did you take, Emily?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Money? Drugs? What are they after?" She swallowed hard, glancing toward the door as if expecting danger to burst through at any moment. "No, it's not drugs, it's information. Something I found, something that could ruin the people I worked for. I thought it would be enough to bargain my way out, but they decided it was easier to make me disappear." Marcus leaned back, running a hand through his hair as the gravity of her confession settled in. He had thought he was just helping a woman down on her luck, but now it seemed he had stumbled into a conspiracy that could destroy them both. He glanced at Lily, nestled against Emily's chest, her small face peaceful in sleep. This wasn't just about him anymore. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress the fear gnawing at his insides. "If they find you, they'll kill you, won't they?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Emily's silence was all the confirmation he needed. Marcus forced himself to think, to push aside the chaos and focus on a plan. "All right, we can't stay here. They'll come back, and the police won't be able to protect us from whoever these people are. Do you still have whatever they're looking for?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she reached into her coat pocket, producing a small, weathered USB drive. "This is all I have left," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know if it's worth anything anymore, but it's the reason they're hunting me." Marcus stared at the USB drive, a tiny object that now held the power to reshape both their fates. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Run and save himself, or stay and help her fight a battle he never asked for. Every instinct told him to walk away, to cut his losses and leave this mess behind. But when he looked into Emily's eyes, saw the raw desperation and the glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. He knew he couldn't turn back. "Give me that," he said, taking the drive from her hand. "If this is what they want, then we have some leverage. But we're going to need a plan, somewhere to hide, somewhere they won't find us until we figure out what's on this thing." Emily looked at him, surprise flickering in her expression. You're really going to help me?" she asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Marcus managed a grim smile, slipping the USB into his pocket. "Let's just say I've never been good at walking away from a bad deal, and if those men come back, I want to be ready." They gathered what little they had and slipped out of the hospital. The rain still falling in a steady drizzle outside, Marcus led Emily to a new car he had arranged, one with fake plates and tinted windows, a relic of his own past that he thought he'd never need again. They drove through the city's back streets, slipping away into the shadows, the city lights fading into the distance, as they vanished into the rain-soaked night, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But as he glanced at Emily beside him, clutching Lily and staring out at the passing streets, he knew there was no turning back now. They were in this together. Whether they survived or not would depend on what secrets the drive held, and how far they were willing to go to. Protect each other, and as the darkness closed in around them, Marcus realized one thing with chilling certainty. The real danger had only just begun. Marcus guided the car down narrow, winding streets, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror for any signs of pursuit. The city's familiar skyline faded behind them, replaced by old industrial buildings and shadowy warehouses that stood like sentinels in the rain-soaked night. He knew they needed to stay off the grid. No more hospitals, no more credit cards. Whoever these people were, they would be watching for any trace. Emily sat beside him, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard, clutching Lily close. The baby had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep. But Marcus could feel Emily's tension, the weight of unspoken fears between them. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead. They needed a safe place, somewhere quiet where they could work out their next move. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting danger to materialize out of the darkness behind them. Marcus hesitated before answering, his mind racing through the few options they had left. "There's a storage unit I keep outside the city limits," he said finally, his voice grim. "It's not much, but it's out of sight and it's got a generator. We can lay low there, at least until we figure out what's on that drive." Emily nodded, but Marcus could see the doubt in her eyes. She still didn't fully trust him, and he couldn't blame her. Not after all she had been through. But as the car slipped onto a deserted road, the city lights fading into the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into a storm far more dangerous than anything they'd faced so far. The storage unit was in a rundown industrial area, surrounded by a chain-link fence that creaked in the wind. Marcus parked the car and led Emily and Lily inside, unlocking a rusted metal door that groaned as it swung open. The space was small, cluttered with old tools and boxes, but it was dry and hidden from prying eyes. He flipped on a small lamp powered by the generator, casting a dim glow over the room. Emily settled Lily onto a makeshift bed. Marcus had fashioned from blankets and an old mattress. The baby stirred but stayed asleep, her tiny hands curling around the edges of the blanket. Marcus watched for a moment, a strange ache tugging at his chest. He turned away quickly, focusing on the task at hand. "Let's see what's on this thing," he muttered, pulling the USB drive from his pocket and plugging it into an old laptop he kept in the unit. Emily sat beside him, leaning forward with tense anticipation. Her breath held as the screen flickered to life. At first, the drive appeared empty, a blank screen with no files. Marcus frowned, clicking through the folders, but found nothing. "It's encrypted," he said, his frustration bubbling up. "Whoever set this up didn't want anyone accessing it easily." Emily's face fell, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know the password. I never got a chance to..." she began, but before she could finish, a faint beep interrupted them, and a message box popped up on the screen. "Enter key code," it read. The text pulsing in the darkness. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "Wait, what key code?" he muttered, glancing at Emily, but she shook her head, just as confused as he was. He stared at the screen, trying to think. They couldn't afford to guess wrong and risk triggering a security lock, or, worse, wiping the data. Just as he was about to give up, Emily's eyes widened, with a sudden realization. "Lily's birthday!" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was the last thing I thought of before everything fell apart. Try Joit Tweno." Marcus hesitated, then typed in the numbers. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the screen processed the entry. Finally, with a low hum, the files unlocked, revealing a series of folders labeled with cryptic names. Transcripts, transfers, witness statements. Emily covered her mouth with a trembling hand as the weight of what they were seeing sank in. This is everything. The people I worked for, their deals, the money laundering, evidence that could bring them down. Marcus scrolled through the files, his mind spinning. If this information fell into the wrong hands, it could ruin powerful people, people who clearly had no qualms about resorting to violence. But if they could get it to the right authorities, it might just be their ticket out of this nightmare. Before they could delve deeper, a sudden noise outside shattered the silence. A car door slamming, followed by the murmur of low voices. Marcus tensed, his blood turning to ice. He moved quickly, closing the laptop and shoving it under a pile of boxes. He motioned for Emily to stay quiet, pressing a finger to his lips as he peered through a crack in the metal door. In the faint light of a distant street lamp, he saw 2 figures, silhouetted, moving stealthily toward the storage unit. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. It was the same men from before, their shadows long and menacing in the rain. They must have followed them, tracked their movements somehow. Marcus turned back to Emily, his voice barely more than a breath. "We have to get out of here now." Emily nodded, but just as they began to gather their things, Lily stirred, letting out a soft, distressed cry. The sound seemed to cut through the night, echoing in the narrow space. Marcus winced, glancing back toward the door, where the footsteps outside paused, then quickened, heading straight for them. "Go, go!" Marcus urged, pushing Emily toward the back exit of the unit. He grabbed the laptop, clutching it to his chest as they slipped out into the rain-soaked alley behind the building. They moved through the darkness, footsteps splashing through puddles. The sound of their pursuers growing closer with every second as they rounded a corner. Marcus spotted an old service tunnel, half hidden by overgrown weeds and debris. He pulled Emily toward it, ducking inside just as a flashlight beam swept past the alley. They crouched in the shadows, breathless and soaked, the cold biting through their clothes. Marcus could hear the men searching nearby, their voices growing frustrated as they failed to find any trace of their quarry. He clutched the laptop tighter, feeling the weight of their fragile hope resting on the evidence hidden within. Emily shivered beside him, her arms wrapped around Lily, her face streaked with rain and tears. "I never wanted this, Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted you to be in danger. I'm sorry." Marcus looked at her, and for a moment, the walls he'd built around himself cracked. He reached out, brushing a damp lock of hair from her face. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his insides. "I'm not going to let them take you or Lily. We'll find a way to end this together." But as they huddled in the darkness, the echoes of their pursuers fading into the distance, Marcus couldn't help but feel the uncertainty gnawing at him. They had the evidence, but they were still alone, hunted in a city that seemed to close in tighter around them with every passing hour, and as the storm raged on outside, he realized that the fight for their survival had only just begun. Marcus and Emily huddled in the shadows of the old service tunnel, the cold air biting through their drenched clothes. Lily whimpered in Emily's arms, and she gently rocked her, trying to keep the baby calm despite the danger pressing in from every side. Marcus listened intently, hearing the footsteps of their pursuers fade into the distance. They had a brief window of time, maybe minutes if they were lucky. "We need to move," Marcus whispered, clutching the laptop tightly. "If they figure out where we went, it's over. We have to get this information to someone who can actually use it." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "But who can we trust, Marcus? Those men, they have connections everywhere. We can't just walk into a police station." Marcus hesitated, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. She was right. Whoever Emily had crossed had deep roots in the city, and they wouldn't hesitate to turn the system against them. But then he remembered an old friend, one of the few people in his life who had never been swayed by money or power. "I know someone, a journalist named Renee Walker. She's not afraid to dig into dangerous stories. If we can reach her, She might be able to make this public before they can shut us down. Emily glanced at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Finally, she nodded, clutching Lily closer. Okay, let's go. They slipped through the tunnel, emerging into an alley on the far side of the industrial complex. Marcus led Emily to another car he had stashed nearby. A beat-up old sedan that wouldn't attract attention. They drove through back roads and side streets, avoiding main routes, their breaths held with every passing set of headlights. The city stretched out like a maze, every shadow concealing potential danger. But finally, they reached the nondescript apartment building where Renee lived. Marcus parked the car and led Emily up the back stairs, his nerves buzzing with urgency. He knocked on the door, praying she would be home. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and a worn leather jacket. Renee's expression shifted from suspicion to shock when she saw Marcus's bedraggled state. "Marcus, what the hell happened to you?" she demanded, her gaze flicking to Emily and Lily, then back to the man she hadn't seen in years. "There's no time to explain," Marcus said, pushing the USB drive into her hand. "This drive, it's evidence, money laundering, illegal deals, everything. They're after us, Renee. We need you to get this story out, or we're dead." Renee's eyes widened as she looked at the drive, then back at Marcus's desperate expression. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded sharply. "Get inside. I'll start decrypting this and see what I can find." They crowded into the small apartment, the air thick with tension. Renee set up her laptop, her fingers flying over the keys as she accessed the files. Marcus paced the room, glancing out the window every few seconds, half expecting to see the shadowy figures. Closing in on them, Emily sat on the edge of a worn couch, rocking Lily and murmuring soft reassurances, but her eyes were fixed on Marcus with a mixture of hope and fear. "Do you think this will work?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the computer. "It has to," Marcus replied, forcing a confidence he didn't fully feel. Renee is good at what she does. If anyone can make this public before they come for us, it's her. But just as Renee began to access the deeper files, the door to the apartment burst open with a crash. Two men stormed in, guns drawn, their faces twisted with anger. They had found them after all. "End of the line, Blackwell!" the taller one sneered, his gaze shifting between Marcus, Emily, and Renee. "Hand over the drive, and maybe we'll make this quick." Renee froze, but Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself between Emily and the men. "You're not getting anything," he said, his voice cold with defiance. "If you kill us, the story will still get out. Renee has copies, and they'll be everywhere before you can bury them." The smaller man's eyes narrowed, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You think we're bluffing?" But before he could react, Emily lunged forward, grabbing a heavy lamp from a nearby table and swinging it with all her strength. The lamp crashed into the smaller man's head, sending him sprawling. Marcus seized the moment, grappling with the taller attacker, wrestling for control of the gun. The room exploded into chaos, with Renee ducking behind her desk, clutching the laptop. Marcus managed to knock the gun free, sending it skittering across the floor. The attacker roared in frustration, throwing a brutal punch that sent Marcus reeling. But Emily was there, joining the fray, kicking and fighting with a ferocity fueled by desperation. Finally, Marcus managed to pin the man against the wall, breathing hard. "Call the police!" he shouted to Renee, who grabbed her phone and dialed, her hands shaking. The sound of sirens grew louder outside, flashing lights cutting through the night. As the police stormed the building, Marcus released his hold on the man, stepping back as officers burst into the room. Weapons drawn, the attackers were quickly subdued, handcuffed, and led away. Their curses echoing down the hallway. As the chaos settled, Marcus collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath, his body aching from the struggle. Emily sank down beside him, clutching Lily as if she might disappear. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. the tension slowly easing from their muscles. Renee approached them, holding the laptop with a faint, grim smile. "You did it, Marcus. I've got enough here to make sure these bastards don't see daylight again. And the story, well, it's going live in an hour. The whole city's going to know the truth." Marcus met her gaze, a weary smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Renee. I owe you. More than I can ever repay." Renee waved him off with a smirk. "You always did have a way of getting into trouble, but you got guts. I'll give you that." She glanced at Emily, her expression softening. "Take care of each other, all right? This city's got enough broken people already." Marcus nodded, turning to Emily as the reality of their survival finally began to sink in. "It's over," he whispered, reaching out to touch her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath the rain and cold. "We made it." Emily's eyes filled with tears, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a hope she thought she'd never feel again. She leaned against him, cradling Lily between them, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that they might have a future. As dawn broke outside the rain-slicked window, casting a pale light over the city below, Marcus felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. He had made mistakes, more than he could count, but this time, he had chosen to fight for something more than himself, and that, he realized, was the start of something new.